An unexpected encounter. The autumn breeze carried a crisp chill as Martha Robinson made her way through the quiet streets of the Cedarwood neighborhood. A vibrant array of orange, yellow, and red leaves painted the sidewalks, crunching softly beneath her feet. She clutched a basket tightly in her hands, its contents a gift for her best friend Clara. Homemade oatmeal cookies and a jar of freshly brewed peach jam. Martha, 68 years old and with an air of quiet dignity, often took comfort in these walks, appreciating the serenity of the neighborhood she had frequented for decades. Today felt no different, at least at first. She hummed softly to herself, her mind wandering to the warm cup of tea that Clara would undoubtedly have waiting for her. Yet, as she rounded a corner and saw two uniformed police officers standing near the end of the street, a strange unease crept over her. She paid them no mind initially, focusing instead on her steps and the anticipation of her visit. But something about the way they glanced at her, lingering, deliberate, made her stomach tighten. Martha had lived in Brookhaven her entire life. She wasn't naive to the prejudices that existed, but she had hoped the peaceful streets of Cedarwood were above such suspicions. Still, she told herself to ignore it and continued on her way, determined not to let their stares unsettle her. The suspicion takes shape. As she passed the officers, she felt the weight of their gaze follow her. Her steps quickened instinctively, but then came the sound of boots on the pavement behind her. The steady rhythm of their approach sent a chill down her spine. Martha turned her head slightly, just enough to confirm what she already knew. They were following her. "Ma'am," one of the officers called out, his voice sharp and commanding. "Can we have a word?" Martha stopped and turned to face them, her basket still clutched tightly in her hands. The officer who spoke was tall and broad-shouldered, his badge reading Preston. His face was stern, his eyes scanning her with an air of suspicion. Behind him stood a younger officer, his nameplate reading Lowe. Lowe looked less certain, his gaze flickering nervously between Preston and Martha. "Yes, officers?" Martha asked, keeping her voice calm but firm. She refused to let them see the unease bubbling within her. "What are you doing in this neighborhood?" Preston asked bluntly. Martha raised an eyebrow at the question, her grip tightening on the basket. "I'm visiting a friend," she replied evenly. "Clara Porter. She lives just down the street." Preston's eyes narrowed. "Do you have some ID on you?" Martha hesitated, her patience already wearing thin. But she wasn't one to escalate unnecessarily. Setting her basket down carefully, she reached into her purse and pulled out her driver's license. Preston took it and examined it with exaggerated scrutiny. "You live across town," he remarked, his tone dripping with suspicion. "Yes, I do," Martha said, her irritation beginning to seep into her voice. "But Clara and I have been friends for over 40 years. I visit her regularly." Preston exchanged a glance with Lowe, who shifted uncomfortably. "What's in the basket?" Preston asked abruptly. Martha blinked, caught off guard by the question. "Cookies," she said, her tone clipped. "I baked them for my friend." "Mind if we take a look?" Preston asked, already stepping forward. Martha pulled the basket closer to her chest. "Yes, I do mind," she said firmly. "This is getting ridiculous. I've done nothing wrong." The situation escalates. Preston's expression darkened, his posture becoming more rigid. "We're just doing our job, Mom." "Your job?" Martha shot back, her voice rising slightly. "Your job is to protect and serve, not to harass people walking to a friend's house." Lowe looked down at his shoes, clearly uncomfortable with the direction the interaction was taking. "Maybe we should just let her go," he mumbled. Preston ignored him, taking another step closer to Martha. "Do you have anything else in your bag we should know about?" he pressed. Martha's hands tightened around the basket. "No, I don't," she said sharply. "Now, if you'll excuse me, I'd like to be on my way." But Preston wasn't done. His hand hovered near his belt, as if considering his next move. Martha felt her pulse quicken, the weight of the moment pressing down on her. For the first time, She felt a flicker of fear, a fear she hadn't known in years, not since her early days of fighting against prejudice and injustice as a young woman. "Look," she said, her voice steady but laced with warning. "You're making a mistake, and if you continue down this path, I promise you'll regret it." Preston scoffed, but before he could respond, a voice called out from behind them. "What's going on here?" An unexpected witness. The three of them turned to see Clara Porter standing at the edge of her driveway, her arms crossed and her expression a mix of confusion and indignation. She was a petite woman with a sharp wit and an unwavering sense of justice, and she wasted no time marching toward them. "Martha, are you all right?" Clara asked, her eyes narrowing at the officers. "I'm fine," Martha replied, though her voice carried a hint of weariness. "Just explaining to these officers that I'm on my way to visit you." Clara's gaze snapped to Preston and Lowe. "Is that right?" she said, her tone icy. "And why exactly are you stopping her?" "Because she's walking with a basket of cookies." Preston opened his mouth to respond, but Clara cut him off. "I've lived in this neighborhood for 30 years, and I've never seen anyone stopped for walking down the street. So what's different about today?" Lowe shifted uncomfortably, while Preston's jaw tightened. "We were just following protocol, Mom," he said defensively. "Well, your protocol needs work," Clara shot back. "And you'd better hope Martha here is feeling generous enough not to report you." Preston's face reddened, but before he could say another word, Martha stepped forward, her calm demeanor commanding the moment. "Thank you, Clara," she said, "but I think it's time these officers learned exactly who they're dealing with." The reveal. Martha reached into her purse once more, this time pulling out a photograph of her son in his police chief uniform. She held it up for Preston and Lowe to see, her expression unyielding. "This is my son," she said, her voice firm. "Chief Robinson, the new head of your department." Preston's eyes widened, and Lowe's face turned ashen. The weight of their mistake hit them like a freight train. Silence hung in the air as Martha let the moment sink in. "I suggest you think very carefully about how you proceed," she continued, "because I can promise you, my son will hear about this." Preston stammered, his confidence evaporating. "Ma'am, we didn't realize." "No," Martha interrupted, her tone sharp. "You didn't, and that's the problem." A mother's patience tested. The two officers stood frozen in front of Martha, their faces a mix of disbelief and panic, as they stared at the photo of her son, Chief Robinson. Yet Martha wasn't ready to let them off the hook so easily. Her heart raced, but she remained composed, a demeanor honed through years of enduring prejudice and adversity. She could see the younger officer, Lowe, fidgeting nervously. Preston, however, tried to mask his embarrassment with a strained expression of authority. An uneasy silence. Martha slipped the photo back into her purse and straightened her posture, staring down the two officers with an intensity that could pierce steel. "So," she began, her voice calm but sharp, "what exactly is the protocol for harassing an elderly woman carrying cookies to a friend's house?" Preston cleared his throat, his bravado faltering. "Ma'am, we didn't mean any disrespect. It was just a routine." "A routine what?" Martha interrupted, her tone unwavering. "Routine harassment. Routine profiling. I'd love to hear how you justify this." Lowe finally mustered the courage to speak. I'm sorry, ma'am. We didn't know who you were." Martha tilted her head slightly, her lips forming a faint, humorless smile. "And if I weren't the mother of your boss, what then? Would you have dragged me to the station for the crime of walking down the street?" The weight of her words hung heavy in the air. Lowe looked down at his feet, clearly uncomfortable, while Preston shifted his stance awkwardly, struggling to regain control of the situation. Clara steps in. Clara, who had been watching the exchange with increasing frustration, decided it was time to interject. "Enough of this nonsense," she snapped, stepping closer to the officers. Despite her petite frame, Clara's presence was formidable. "Martha has been walking these streets for decades. She's one of the kindest, most generous people I know. And yet you too thought it was appropriate to treat her like a suspect. Shame on you." Preston opened his mouth to respond, but Clara wasn't finished. "I don't care what excuse you come up with. This is blatant harassment, and you know it. You should be apologizing, not because she's the chief's mother, but because what you did was wrong." Martha placed a calming hand on Clara's shoulder. "Thank you, Clara," she said softly. "But I think it's time we let them reflect on their actions." The neighborhood watches. As the exchange unfolded, a small crowd had begun to gather at a distance. Neighbors peeked out from behind curtains, some stepping onto their porches to get a better view. Among them was Mr. Harris, a retired teacher known for his stern demeanor but fair judgment. He crossed the street to join the growing group of onlookers, his brow furrowed in concern. "What's going on here?" Mr. Harris called out, his voice carrying a tone of authority that rivaled Preston's. "Is there a problem?" Martha turned to him, her expression softening. "Just a misunderstanding," she said. "These officers seem to think I'm suspicious for walking to Clara's house with a basket of cookies." Mr. Harris's eyes narrowed as he looked at Preston and Lowe. "Suspicious? Martha, I've known this woman for 20 years. If she's suspicious, then I'm Santa Claus." Preston's face turned a deeper shade of red as the neighbors murmured among themselves. The tide of public opinion was clearly turning against the officers, and they both looked increasingly uncomfortable. A call for accountability. Martha decided it was time to take control of the situation. She pulled out her phone and began dialing. Preston's eyes widened as he realized what was happening. "Ma'am, wait," he stammered. "There's no need to." Martha held up a hand to silence him as the call connected. "Hello, Robert," she said, her voice calm but firm. "Yes, I'm fine, but there's something you need to know about. I'm in Cedarwood, and 2 of your officers decided it was appropriate to stop and interrogate me while I was on my way to Clara's house." Preston and Lowe exchanged nervous glances, their confidence crumbling as they realized she was speaking directly to Chief Robinson. The murmurs among the neighbors grew louder, and a few people began recording the scene on their phones. "I see," Martha continued. "Yes, they're here now. Perhaps you'd like to come down and speak with them yourself." "Wonderful. I'll see you soon." She ended the call and slipped her phone back into her purse, her expression as calm as ever. The officers stood in tense silence as the minutes ticked by, the crowd of onlookers growing steadily larger. Clara and Mr. Harris took the opportunity to speak to the neighbors, explaining what had happened and rallying their support for Martha. "This isn't just about Martha," Clara said passionately. "This is about all of us. If they can treat her this way, what's to stop them from doing the same to anyone else?" The neighbors nodded in agreement, their frustration with the officers becoming more vocal. Preston and Lowe, now visibly nervous, avoided eye contact with the crowd. The arrival of the chief. A sleek black police SUV pulled up to the curb, and Chief Robert Robinson stepped out, his presence immediately commanding respect. He was a tall, imposing man with a sharp gaze that could cut through the toughest of exteriors. As he approached the group, the crowd fell silent, watching intently. "Mom," he said warmly, giving Martha a quick hug. "Are you all right?" "I'm fine, Robert," Martha replied. "But I think these 2 have something to explain." Chief Robinson turned his attention to Preston and Lowe, his expression hardening. "Officers," he said, his tone icy, "care to tell me why you decided to stop and interrogate my mother?" Preston stammered, struggling to find the right words. "Sir, we didn't realize who she was." "That's not the point," Robinson snapped. "You shouldn't need to know who someone is to treat them with respect. This is unacceptable behavior, and I won't tolerate it in my department." Lowe, looking thoroughly chastened, finally spoke up. "We're sorry, Chief. We made a mistake." Robinson's gaze didn't soften. "You'll be doing more than apologizing. Report to my office first thing tomorrow morning. We're going to have a very long conversation about proper conduct." A lesson learned. As the officers retreated to their patrol car, The crowd began to disperse, though the air was still thick with tension. Chief Robinson turned to the neighbors, his voice carrying a tone of sincerity. "I want to thank all of you for standing up for my mother," he said. "This community deserves better, and I promise you, we'll do everything in our power to make sure this doesn't happen again." Martha smiled, her heart swelling with pride as she looked at her son. "Thank you, Robert," she said. "And thank you to everyone here. Your support means more than you know." As the sun dipped below the horizon, casting a warm glow over Cedarwood, Martha and Clara walked arm in arm toward the house, the basket of cookies swinging gently at Martha's side. It had been a day of challenges, but also one of triumph, a reminder that even in the face of injustice, unity and courage could light the way forward. Confronting the consequences, the sun began to set, painting the Cedarwood neighborhood in hues of gold and amber, but the tension in the air remained palpable. Chief Robert Robinson stood tall, his piercing eyes fixed on Officers Preston and Lowe. The gathered neighbors looked on in quiet anticipation, their earlier murmurs fading into silence as the moment unfolded. Martha Robinson, his mother, stood nearby, her quiet dignity radiating strength despite the humiliation she had endured just moments ago. Preston and Lowe stood before the chief, visibly uncomfortable under his intense scrutiny. Preston's once commanding demeanor had withered, replaced by a nervous rigidity. Lowe, the younger of the two, looked as though he wanted to disappear entirely. The chief speaks. "Do you know what the badge on your chest represents?" Chief Robinson began, his voice calm but heavy with authority. His tone carried the weight of years of leadership, service, and an unyielding commitment to justice. "It's not just a symbol of authority, it's a symbol of trust. Trust that you will protect and serve everyone in this community, without prejudice or bias." Preston shifted uncomfortably, his mouth opening slightly as though to respond, but no words came out. Robinson held up a hand, silencing him before he could begin. "You stopped my mother," Robinson continued, his voice rising slightly. "An elderly woman carrying cookies to her friend's house. And for what? Because she didn't look like she belonged in this neighborhood. Because of your assumptions." Lowe finally found his voice, his tone hesitant. "Chief, we didn't know that she was my mother." Robinson interrupted, his eyes narrowing. "That's not the issue, Officer Lowe. The issue is that you shouldn't need to know someone's connection to me to treat them with respect." The crowd of neighbors, still lingering nearby, nodded in agreement. Clara, standing next to Martha, crossed her arms and gave Preston and Lowe a pointed look. "Exactly," she muttered under her breath, loud enough for them to hear. Facing the community, Chief Robinson turned his attention to the gathering crowd. "To all of you," he said, addressing the neighbors directly, "I owe you an apology. This kind of behavior has no place in Brookhaven, and it's my responsibility as Chief of Police to ensure it doesn't happen again." The crowd murmured in approval, and a few people clapped. Martha watched her son with pride, though her expression remained composed. She knew this was about more than just her. It was about holding people accountable and setting a precedent for the future. Preston's face turned a deep shade of red, and Lowe's shoulders slumped. It was clear that they were beginning to understand the gravity of their actions, though the chief wasn't done yet. "I want both of you to apologize to my mother," Robinson said, his tone firm. "Right now." Preston hesitated, glancing at Lowe before stepping forward. He cleared his throat awkwardly. "Mrs. Robinson, I'm sorry for how I treated you. It was wrong, and I made a mistake." Lowe followed suit, his voice barely above a whisper. "I'm sorry, ma'am. I should have spoken up sooner." Martha nodded, her expression softening slightly. "Thank you," she said simply. "I appreciate your apology, but actions speak louder than words. I hope you'll take this experience as a lesson and do better in the future." A turning point. The chief turned back to the officers. "You will both report to my office tomorrow morning for a full review of this incident, and you will undergo mandatory bias training effective immediately. Do I make myself clear?" "Yes, Chief." Preston and Lowe replied in unison, their voices subdued. "Good," Robinson said, his tone leaving no room for argument. "Dismissed." The two officers nodded and walked back to their patrol car, their heads hanging low. As they drove away, the crowd slowly began to disperse, though the energy of the moment lingered in the air. Neighbors exchanged quiet words of encouragement with Martha and Clara, offering their support and solidarity. A heartfelt conversation. As the crowd thinned, Chief Robinson turned to his mother. His stern expression softened, and he placed a gentle hand on her shoulder. "Mom, I'm so sorry you had to go through that," he said, his voice filled with genuine remorse. Martha smiled faintly, patting his hand. "It's not your fault, Robert. You can't control every officer's actions, but you handled it well, and that's what matters." Clara chimed in, her tone playful but affectionate. "He gets that from you, Martha. You've always been the calm in the storm." Martha chuckled softly, her tension finally beginning to ease. "Maybe so, but it doesn't make it any easier when you're the one being targeted." Robert nodded, his jaw tightening. "It shouldn't have happened, Mom. And I promise you, I'll do everything in my power to make sure it doesn't happen again. Not to you, not to anyone." Martha looked at her son, pride shining in her eyes. "I know you will," she said. "And that's why I'm so proud of you." A neighborhood united. As the three of them stood together, a few remaining neighbors approached to offer their support. Mr. Harris, the retired teacher, spoke up first. "Chief, I want you to know that we're behind you. What happened today was unacceptable, but the way you handled it gives me hope for this community." Others echoed his sentiments, and soon the small group was engaged in a lively discussion about how to create a more inclusive and respectful neighborhood. Ideas ranged from community forums to cultural awareness events, and Martha couldn't help but feel a glimmer of hope amidst the earlier tension. "This could be a turning point," Clara said, nudging Martha gently. "Maybe something good can come out of all this." Martha nodded, her gaze sweeping over the group. "It already has," she said. "People are talking, coming together. That's where change begins. A new chapter." As the evening wore on and the last of the neighbors departed, Martha and Clara finally made their way inside Clara's cozy home. The aroma of freshly brewed tea greeted them, and they settled into the living room with their cups in hand. "You know," Clara said thoughtfully, "it's not every day you get to see a police chief publicly hold his own officers accountable. Your son's a good man, Martha." Martha smiled, warmth filling her chest. "He is," she agreed. "And so are the people in this community. Today wasn't easy, but it reminded me that there's still hope. And a lot of good people willing to stand up for what's right." Outside, the streets of Cedarwood were quiet once more, the golden light of street lamps casting long shadows. But within the hearts of those who had witnessed the day's events, a newfound sense of unity and purpose began to take root, a promise of a brighter, more just tomorrow. The community's call to action. The events of the day had left an indelible mark on the Cedarwood neighborhood. As the sun dipped below the horizon, a deep sense of reflection settled over the residents. The incident involving Martha Robinson had ignited a spark, a collective realization that change was not only necessary but urgent. The neighbors, some hesitant at first, began rallying around the Taylor family and their unwavering resolve to stand against injustice. Martha sat on Clara's porch, sipping a warm cup of tea as the crisp evening air swirled around them. Her son, Chief Robert Robinson, stood nearby, his shoulders visibly weighed down by the events of the day. Despite the tension, the sense of solidarity among the neighbors gave the night a hopeful undertone. Gathering the neighborhood, word spread quickly about what had happened earlier. By the time the next day rolled around, Clara had already taken the initiative to organize a neighborhood meeting. Flyers were distributed, and a simple message was printed on each one. "Cedarwood. Let's talk about what matters." The meeting was set to take place at the local community center, a modest but welcoming building nestled at the heart of the neighborhood. As the evening approached, Residents began streaming in, some curious, others determined. Families, young and old, filled the seats, their voices a mix of chatter and subdued murmurs. Martha entered the hall with Clara by her side, both greeted warmly by the gathering crowd. Chief Robinson arrived shortly after, dressed in plain clothes to emphasize that he was there not as the chief of police but as a member of the community. He exchanged nods and handshakes with several neighbors, his presence commanding quiet respect. Opening the discussion, Clara, ever the community organizer, took to the small podium at the front of the room. "Thank you all for coming," she began, her voice firm yet inviting. "What happened yesterday was unacceptable. But it also gave us an opportunity, a chance to come together and address the issues that have been simmering beneath the surface for far too long." The room fell silent as Clara continued. "This isn't just about what happened to Martha. It's about ensuring that every single person in this neighborhood feels safe, respected, and valued. And that starts with us." A murmur of agreement rippled through the room. Clara gestured to Martha, who stood and walked to the podium with a quiet grace that commanded attention. Martha's message. "Thank you, Clara," Martha said, her voice steady despite the emotions swirling within her. She looked out at the crowd, her gaze sweeping across the faces of her neighbors. "I want to start by saying that I hold no ill will toward anyone here. What happened yesterday was a reflection of a much larger issue, one that affects all of us." She paused, letting her words sink in. "I've lived in Brookhaven for decades. I've seen this community grow and change. But I've also seen how fear and prejudice can create walls between us. Yesterday, those walls were on full display. And while it was painful, it also reminded me that we have the power to tear them down." The audience listened intently as Martha continued. "This isn't just about me. It's about our children, our families, and the kind of future we want to build. We can't change the past, but we can shape what comes next. And that starts with open, honest conversations, no matter how uncomfortable they might be." The crowd responds. Martha's words were met with a mix of nods and thoughtful expressions. A hand went up in the audience, and Mr. Harris, the retired teacher, stood to speak. "I think what happened to Martha is a wake-up call for all of us," he said. "We can't ignore these issues anymore. We need to hold ourselves accountable as a community." A younger woman, Sarah, chimed in. "I agree, but how do we start? How do we make sure something like this doesn't happen again?" Chief Robinson, who had been listening quietly, rose from his seat. "It starts with awareness," he said. "We need to educate ourselves and each other. That means bias training, community workshops, and regular forums where we can discuss these issues openly. And it also means holding our law enforcement accountable, including me." The room buzzed with a renewed sense of purpose. Ideas began to flow, some suggesting cultural awareness events, others proposing mentorship programs for the youth. The energy in the room was electric, fueled by a collective desire to create meaningful change. A proposal for change. Martha stepped back to the podium, her heart swelling with hope as she listened to the passionate ideas being shared. "I have a suggestion," she said, her voice cutting through the chatter. The room fell silent once more. "Let's create a community task force, a group of residents, law enforcement, and local leaders who can work together to address these issues head-on." Her proposal was met with enthusiastic applause. Clara leaned over and whispered, "That's a brilliant idea, Martha." Chief Robinson nodded in agreement. "I'll make sure the police department is fully on board," he said. "This is exactly the kind of partnership we need." The task force takes shape. By the end of the meeting, a dozen volunteers had stepped forward to join the task force, including Clara, Mr. Harris, and even some of the younger residents like Sarah. Chief Robinson pledged to dedicate resources from the police department to support their efforts, and the room buzzed with a sense of optimism. As the meeting wrapped up, neighbors lingered to chat, their conversations filled with hope and determination. Martha stood by the door, shaking hands and exchanging kind words with each person who passed by. For the first time in a long while, She felt a sense of unity and purpose in the community she called home. A glimmer of hope. That night, as Martha and Clara walked home together under the glow of street lamps, they reflected on the day's events. "You know," Clara said, "I think this might be the start of something incredible." Martha smiled, her heart light despite the challenges of the past few days. "I think so too, Clara. Change doesn't come easy, but it's worth every step." As they reached Clara's front porch, Martha looked back at the quiet streets of Cedarwood. They were the same streets she had walked for years, but tonight they felt different, brighter, more welcoming, and filled with the promise of a better tomorrow. The ripple effect. The Cedarwood neighborhood awoke to a renewed sense of purpose the day after the community meeting. Word of the task force and the unified stand against prejudice had spread beyond the immediate area, reaching neighboring communities, local media, and even city officials. Martha Robinson's dignified stand, coupled with Chief Robert Robinson's firm actions, had become the talk of Brookhaven. However, not everyone welcomed the change with open arms. Challenges surface. While many residents of Cedarwood embraced the idea of the task force, there were those who resisted the shift. A small but vocal group of individuals began murmuring about overreaction and unnecessary changes. Among them was Mr. Walton, an older resident known for his staunch traditionalist views. One morning, as Martha walked past his neatly trimmed lawn on her way to Clara's house, Walton called out to her. His voice carried a mix of skepticism and annoyance. "Martha, can I have a word?" Martha paused, turning to face him. "Of course, Mr. Walton. What's on your mind?" Walton approached, his hands stuffed into the pockets of his cardigan. "I've lived in this neighborhood for over 30 years, he began, "and I've never seen such a fuss over one little misunderstanding." Martha's eyes narrowed slightly, but she kept her tone calm. "A little misunderstanding," she echoed. "Mr. Walton, I was profiled, humiliated, and questioned without cause. That's not a misunderstanding. It's a symptom of a much larger problem." Walton shifted uncomfortably, clearly unprepared for her directness. "Look, I'm not saying what happened was right," he said, avoiding her gaze. "But do we really need all this upheaval? This neighborhood's been fine the way it is." Martha took a deep breath, her patience unwavering. "Fine for whom, Mr. Walton?" she asked. "Because it hasn't been fine for everyone. And pretending otherwise won't make the problem go away." Their exchange ended with Walton mumbling something under his breath and retreating into his house. Martha continued her walk, undeterred. She knew change was rarely easy, but she was determined to see it through. The task force in action. Meanwhile, the newly formed Cedarwood Community Task Force began its work in earnest. The group, made up of a diverse mix of residents, law enforcement, and local leaders, met regularly to discuss strategies for fostering inclusivity and addressing bias. Their first major initiative was a neighborhood survey designed to gather input from residents about their experiences and concerns. Chief Robinson personally ensured that the survey was distributed widely, emphasizing the importance of hearing from every voice in the community. At the same time, Clara spearheaded plans for a community-wide cultural fair. The event, intended to celebrate the diverse backgrounds of Cedarwood's residents, was scheduled for the following month. Clara's enthusiasm was infectious, and soon dozens of neighbors had volunteered to help. Resistance and support. As the task force's efforts gained momentum, the initial resistance from individuals like Mr. Walton began to fade. Seeing their neighbors' dedication and the positive energy surrounding the initiatives, even skeptics started to come around. One evening, Martha received an unexpected knock on her door. When she opened it, she found Mrs. Green, a quiet woman who rarely ventured out of her house, standing on the porch. "Martha," Mrs. Green began hesitantly, "I just wanted to say thank you for everything you're doing." Martha was taken aback, but deeply touched. "Thank you, Mrs. Green," she said warmly. "That means a lot." Mrs. Green nodded, her expression softening. "I've lived here for years, but I've always felt Invisible. Like I didn't belong. But what you're doing, it's making a difference. For all of us. The exchange reaffirmed Martha's resolve. She realized that the impact of the task force extended far beyond her own experiences. It was giving a voice to those who had long felt silenced. Confronting the past. As the task force delved deeper into its work, Chief Robinson initiated a department-wide review of police practices in Brookhaven. The review uncovered troubling patterns of bias, prompting immediate reforms. Preston and Lowe, the officers who had stopped Martha, were among those required to undergo intensive bias training. For Lowe, the experience was eye-opening. He began to question his own assumptions and biases, realizing how they had influenced his actions. Preston, on the other hand, struggled with the changes. His initial defensiveness gradually gave way to a grudging acceptance as he saw the positive impact of the reforms. One day, he approached Chief Robinson privately. "Chief," Preston began, his tone uncharacteristically humble, "I just wanted to say, I was wrong. About everything. And I'm sorry." Robinson regarded him carefully before nodding. "Acknowledging your mistakes is the first step, Preston," he said. "Now it's time to make sure they don't happen again." Building bridges. The cultural fair quickly became the talk of the town. On the day of the event, Cedarwood Park was transformed into a vibrant hub of activity. Booths showcasing different cultures lined the pathways, each one bursting with color, music, and the tantalizing aroma of food. Martha and Clara manned a booth together, offering homemade treats and sharing stories about their lifelong friendship. Nearby, Chief Robinson hosted a Meet the Police booth where officers engaged with residents in a relaxed and friendly setting. The highlight of the event was a storytelling circle where neighbors shared personal anecdotes about their experiences in Cedarwood. When it was Martha's turn, she spoke with grace and honesty, recounting the incident that had sparked the community's transformation. "I've lived in Brookhaven for decades," she said, her voice steady, "and I've seen the best and worst of what this community can be. But standing here today, surrounded by all of you, I see hope. I see a future where everyone belongs." Her words were met with resounding applause, and Clara leaned over to whisper, "You've always had a way with words, Martha." A new beginning. As the fair drew to a close, Martha stood with her son, watching as neighbors laughed, chatted, and shared meals together. The sense of unity was palpable, and for the first time in a long while, Cedarwood felt like a true community. Chief Robinson turned to his mother, his expression one of quiet pride. "You were right, Mom," he said. "Change starts with people willing to stand up and say, 'Enough is enough.'" Martha smiled, her heart full. "And it takes a community willing to listen and grow," she added. "We still have a long way to go, but tonight is a good start." A lasting legacy. The Cedarwood Cultural Fair had been an overwhelming success. It had not only united the neighborhood, but had also set a precedent for how communities could come together to address long-standing issues of prejudice and bias. Yet for Martha Robinson, the journey felt far from over. Change had begun to bloom in Cedarwood, but she knew that sustaining it would require more than good intentions. It would demand commitment, accountability, and a willingness to grow. The morning after, the day after the fair, Martha sat on Clara's porch, a warm cup of tea in her hands. The morning was quiet, the neighborhood still basking in the afterglow of the previous evening's unity. Yet Martha's mind was already racing with ideas on how to keep the momentum going. "I don't want this to be a one-time thing," Martha said, breaking the comfortable silence between her and Clara. "We've started something important, but it's so easy for people to slip back into old habits." Clara nodded thoughtfully, her hands folded in her lap. "You're right. But you've already shown them what's possible, Martha. That's half the battle." Just then, Chief Robert Robinson arrived, carrying a folder brimming with documents. He looked tired but resolute, his uniform neatly pressed. "Morning, ladies," he said with a warm smile. "Mind if I join you?" Martha gestured to the empty chair beside her. "Of course. What's on your mind, Robert?" He set the folder on the table and exhaled deeply. "I wanted to talk about next steps," he began. "The task force has been incredible, but we need to solidify some of the changes we've started. I've been working on a proposal to make bias training mandatory for all officers, not just here in Brookhaven, but across the county." Martha's eyes lit up. "That's exactly what we need," she said. "But how do you plan to get it approved?" Robert leaned back in his chair, a determined look on his face. "I'll present it to the city council next week. They've already taken notice of what we've accomplished in Cedarwood. If we show them that this isn't just about one incident, that it's about building a stronger, more just community, I think they'll support it." Clara clapped her hands together. "That's wonderful, Robert, and you know we'll be there to back you up." A personal revelation. As they discussed the proposal, Robert hesitated for a moment before speaking again. "Mom, there's something I've been meaning to say," he began, his voice softer. "When I became chief, I thought I understood the challenges our community faced. But seeing what you went through, what so many people go through every day, it's opened my eyes in ways I didn't expect." Martha reached over and placed a hand on his. "Robert, leadership isn't about knowing all the answers from the start. It's about being willing to learn and grow. And you've done that. I couldn't be prouder of you." Robert's shoulders relaxed, a small smile playing on his lips. "Thanks, Mom. That means a lot." An unexpected visitor. Later that afternoon, as Martha and Clara were tidying up the porch, a familiar figure approached the house. It was Preston, one of the officers who had wrongly stopped Martha. He looked different, not just in his casual clothes but in his demeanor. The arrogance that had once defined him was gone, replaced by a quiet humility. "Martha," he began, his voice uncertain, "I hope I'm not intruding." Martha exchanged a glance with Clara before stepping forward. "Not at all, Officer Preston. What brings you here?" He hesitated, then took a deep breath. "I just wanted to say, I'm sorry. Not just for what happened that day, but for all the assumptions I've made. About you, about other people. The training we've been doing. It's made me realize how much I've overlooked, how much I've taken for granted." Martha studied him for a moment, her expression unreadable. Then she nodded. "Apology accepted," she said. "But remember, words are only the beginning. What matters is what you do moving forward." Preston nodded earnestly. "I understand, and I'll do better." As he left, Clara turned to Martha with a raised eyebrow. "Well, that was unexpected." Martha smiled faintly. "Maybe, but it's a step in the right direction." The city council meeting. A week later, the city council chamber was packed. Residents from Cedarwood and beyond had turned out to support Chief Robinson's proposal for mandatory bias training. Martha sat in the front row, her presence a quiet but powerful reminder of why this initiative mattered. Robert stood at the podium, addressing the council with a calm confidence that belied the weight of the moment. "This isn't just about one incident," he said. "It's about ensuring that every resident of our city feels safe, respected, and valued. Bias training isn't a punishment. It's an opportunity to grow, to understand, and to serve our community better." As he spoke, Martha felt a swell of pride. Her son's words were met with applause, and when the council voted unanimously to approve the proposal, the room erupted in cheers. A new chapter. In the weeks that followed, the changes began to take root. Officers underwent rigorous training, and the task force expanded its initiatives, hosting regular community forums and cultural events. Cedarwood became a model for other neighborhoods, proving that unity and accountability could coexist. Martha continued to play an active role, her quiet strength and wisdom guiding the task force's efforts. She often reflected on how far they had come, not just as a neighborhood, but as a community willing to confront its flaws and strive for something better. A legacy of hope. One evening, as the sun set over Cedarwood, Martha sat on her porch, watching children play in the street and neighbors chat amicably. Clara joined her, carrying 2 cups of tea. "Look at them," Clara said, gesturing to the bustling street. "This is what we've been working for." Martha nodded, a contented smile on her face. "It's not perfect," she said, "but it's a start, and sometimes that's all you need." As the first stars appeared in the sky, Martha felt a deep sense of peace. The journey had been challenging, but it had also been worth every step. Together, they had turned a moment of injustice into a movement for change, a legacy that would endure for generations to come.